smuggling and the high school life, living by yourself and reading books, you know that's every writer would know that that's a juicy story to tell. And so I thought, well, it's time to tell it. And also, there had been at that time several other sort of prison books that had come out that I'd read that, kind of made me sniff them out, thinking, it's just, that's not quite as authentic as I think. So I thought, why let somebody else guess at it when it's, it's my story? So then I wrote Hole in My Life, and I wrote it about as honestly as I possibly could, because being a fiction writer, even with your own life, you feel like you could improve it every time. And so I was pretty spot on with that. And then that book went out, and then that book really received its own really solid audience, of teens, of adults, and the book has continued to stay alive and still gets out there. And I do a lot of speaking in high schools. I go to prisons all the time and work with young men in prisons, because they have ed programs, education programs, and they have to read, so they have to read that book. And that's a good galvanizing book, to come in and say, well, I was in your shoes, and I was in this situation, and here's what I did. They all have to read the book in order for me to come in. And I go over it with them, and we have great discussions, incredible discussions. And, you walk in and you think, oh, my God, these are the guys you don't want to run into in a dark alley with. And no, these are like fairly scary-looking guys sometimes. Not all of them, but some of them. And they'll look at you and go, well, how did your mom feel when you went to prison? And you're thinking, that's not the question you thought that person was going to ask you. But we realize that, we're all really deeply connected emotionally, and we have so much more in common, regardless of our situations, in prison, out of prison, writing books, not writing books, that we have that commonality. And so it's great to really tap that. And, and also for those guys, too, to think they have stories, they have an entry into writing as well, and with reading. And, to realize and witness that on the other side, on the other side of the bars, there's a life that they can go ahead and pursue. And you don't have to be defined in a small way by the mistakes you've made, that you can, carry forth and then expand the definition of who you are. So with me going to prison, that's a very small chapter in my entire life. It's a good chapter, I like it, and I'm glad I did the book, but it's not the full definition of who I am. But for some of those guys, that is the definition, and now they've got to move on too, and in a positive way, I hope. So I like being part of their world. And so talking about it is not just like, talking about your mom and dad, and your brothers and sisters, and your dogs and cats, and by the way, I went to prison. It's a great line at the cocktail party.
Okay, and this is the second video.
I speak in prisons, and I do a lot of public library speaking, and high school speaking as well. And a lot of times, I'm brought into areas where you might have kind of a low economic situation. You have places where, books may not be the first choice of an activity, and that, the educational goals for maybe the students aren't necessarily as high as you would see elsewhere. So because of that book, I end up getting into the nice, squeaky, difficult parts, the dirty zones maybe sometimes, and I like it, because they're great. One of the things about these guys is they're really honest, and if they like the book, they'll come up to you and say so. So once, and it was a nice town in New Jersey, and this is a fairly typical kind of story. So I was speaking there, and I was speaking about this book, among other books, and there was a tough-looking kid in the back. Kind of had his head lowered down and looking up through his eyebrows all the time. And then there was this young, sort of blonde, really enthusiastic person sitting next to him, and then there was this, sort of middle-aged woman. And so finally I talked, and everybody left, and they didn't leave. So I kind of thought, it's a little odd. So I sort of walked down toward them, and I said hello. And then the mother was like, stand up, and blood stand up. So the guy gets up, and God, he was just, he was a pretty strong kid. So the mother says, tell him. So he kind of looks up, he finally looks me in the eye, and he goes, this is the first book I ever finished. You know? And the young woman was his reading teacher from school. And the mother was just so proud that he had finished a book and brought him down here. And the reading teacher was young and enthusiastic, you know, so she hadn't been worn out, you know. And he was there. And then he said, I would have given it to my friend to read, but he's in prison. And so, we could send it. You know, we'll send him a copy. We'll take care of that, which we did. And so, but that kind of, little story is just amazing to me to see this kid come forward and to have a book and then to hope, to walk away, thinking, well, maybe that's the first of many books. That's really where we want to go. So, I see a lot of that with this book. It's a teen boy book that really seems to want to be, the first book through the door.
Okay, after seeing both of those clips with the person next to you, if your opinion has changed or is still the same, share whether or not you think this book should be taught in schools. Just for like a minute or so.
I think that a lot of authors write really great fiction books that aren't from experience, but just and it just like finishes like on reality and feel the pain and struggles, and it's like a genuine book that feels like a redemption. But in an extreme way, where like buy these things. So it's kind of a metaphor.
I like it because it's not like really so it's like a lot of these tools can get really graphic, and it's like it's just suitable for a child to be like, oh, this can happen, but it's not really Alright, 30 more seconds.
But I was really surprised, like the F word was used I think 4 times in the book, and I think it would be really hard in a classroom setting to introduce like prison rape to kids if they've never heard of it. And I think if you want to seek out and read this book on your own, then go ask your teacher about it. It's good.
Alright, if you guys can wrap up your thoughts. Okay, I can tell that this is a very personal topic for a lot of you. I definitely know that I have a lot of opinions for it. Could we hear first from somebody who definitely thinks this should be taught in schools? Does anyone have that opinion? Yeah, Arlie.
I think that it should definitely be taught in schools. Obviously not, or at least in my mind, not in elementary school, because that's kind of like.
Yeah, definitely for younger audience.
But I feel like 7th and 8th grade, even though we'd like to think that they don't have influences on them, like that's when a lot of drug use and alcoholism starts these days. Like I feel like it seems like when I was a kid that this would be a book strictly for like high school and that there wasn't a whole lot of that stuff, but it's like since the world has changed so drastically, I feel like the book is a good kind of like a kick in the butt in a sense to the thing like if you go off this path, and you stop caring about school and you start doing these things, it's like it will have an effect on you. Maybe not to the extent that it happened to Jack Gontos, but it will have an effect on you.
Right. Would anyone like to agree or disagree with Arlie's comment? Yeah, Sarah.
Okay, I actually disagree. I think for young adults, it would be really hard to lead a classroom discussion on things like prison rape, and the F word was brought up a few times, which I just don't think is appropriate. I know kids can be influenced by that stuff, but I think in a classroom setting, some of the kids aren't, and it might be hard for them to deal with those things. But on the other hand, I think a teacher could privately assign a student a book if he or she was looking for material like this, but definitely have a discussion when the student finishes reading the book and just kind of discuss some of the themes and how it could have affected them, because I feel like some kids could actually be like almost a little traumatized by reading this book, especially like